Okay, brother.
I'm glad you walked in. I wasn't recording this.
All right.
I think by the end of this course, I'm going to figure out how to use this technical stuff here.
How about that?
I don't think we missed too much. Jerome won't miss too much about that. But let's talk about the way up. And I think it's very simple. I think we plan the work of developing leadership and we work the plan. I think it's just that simple. I think sometimes we overcomplicate the work of the church and the work of leadership, and I don't think it's in some ways as complicated as some people would make it. I think it's if we develop a proper plan and we work that plan, I think the results are going to be developing effective, productive leaders in the Lord's church. And that's how I look at this thing, and that's how we're going to approach it. As Christians, we all have individual responsibilities to grow spiritually. We know that. But elders, I think, have a three-pronged responsibility there. They have an individual to develop themselves spiritually for leadership and to continue developing after they become elders. It's not an idea that we've arrived the day we get appointed and now we can sit back and enjoy the honorary title. That's not it at all. We have to continue to develop ourselves spiritually as elders. We have to develop the congregation. We have to, from a corporate level, we have to help the congregation develop spiritually and continue to grow spiritually. And finally, and what we'll talk about more tonight is that we identify men and work with them to develop the leadership potential in men that we see that have the potential for leadership. How do we go about setting up a plan to help develop men to become leaders, effective leaders in our congregations? And that's what we want to talk about tonight. First of all, I think that the current eldership has to create and maintain an environment of trust and respect for the office of elder. I can't stress that enough. Why is that so important? Why is that so important for an eldership to create and maintain an environment of trust and respect with the eldership in that congregation?
If the congregation can't trust and respect the elders, I mean, it's almost like, in a sense, the eldership is like they are God's leadership for the church, but it's God's example. If we don't have respect for them, we're not going to have respect for God. Okay. That's exactly right. We're not going to have respect for, if we don't respect for them, we're not going to have respect for God. The elders don't control the paychecks of the members, do they? They can't withhold a paycheck if they don't get what they want. Why? And we know it reverts back to shepherds and sheep. Because why do the sheep follow the shepherd? Because they trust and respect that shepherd, don't they? That's why they follow him. That he's not going to do anything that's going to cause them harm. He's going to keep them well fed and protected. So they listen to his voice. And that's the metaphor we have there that's given to us in the Bible about shepherds today and shepherds back then, that they have to be able, I've seen when you have the trust and respect of the congregation, it makes the elder's job so much easier to oversee that flock. But if they do something or don't do something or say something that causes the congregation to lose a certain amount of that respect and trust, then you're going to have problems are going to arise in that congregation. When an eldership loses trust and respect, who knows about that as fast as anybody does? Satan knows about it, doesn't he? Satan knows when there's a problem with the eldership, and he's going to attack that eldership in that congregation. It's so important. Something I've always said and heard about a good reputation is what? It's hard to attain, it's easy to lose, and almost impossible to gain back. That seems just the way our culture is, or our society is. That we see it with our politicians all the time, that they find out something about their past, or they say something, or do something, or don't do something that causes them to lose their reputation, and it's very difficult to turn that back around again. That doesn't mean elders obviously are not perfect and they make mistakes, and the congregation can certainly understand that.
But if you start to lose that respect and trust, it's very difficult to get that back. And if you can't get that back, then you're going to have a very difficult time leading and overseeing that congregation as God would have us to do that. How important that is on a personal and a corporate level. Keep the trust and respect of the congregation. I think I mentioned it the first week. I used the expression set the bar high for commitment, faithfulness, and love of God. The elders have, that should be their goal, is to set that bar as high as possible. And we talked about the first week about why is that so important, because I'm just throwing a percentage out there, but 95% plus of members of the congregation are going to be somewhere below that bar for commitment, faithfulness, and love of God and His Word and the church. They're going to be below the elders. Whatever level of commitment and faithfulness and love that the elders have, the vast majority of the congregation is going to be somewhere below that, because they look to the eldership as being the leaders of that. That's to set the bar. So if that bar starts to come down, then the love and commitment and faithfulness congregation is going to come down. The elderships pull that down with them, or they can build that back up. They can pull the congregation up, or they can pull it down. So it's so important to maintain that high level, because it's very rare that you have a member that has a higher level of commitment, faithfulness, or love for God than the eldership does. So that's why it's so important that we develop men and wives that understand the responsibility of elders. And this is in a broad sense now. We're not getting into real specifics yet, but first step we would do, and if you may have seen there's a couple exhibits in the book that deal with this, and I'll mention the numbers here in just a minute. Identify and categorize potential leaders, whether that be deacons or elders. And I did this into 3 categories, and these are obviously not set in stone, but what I looked at was men that we believed, the eldership believed, could be a deacon or an elder within the next 1 to 3 years. A medium term that men would be in the 3 to 5 year range as being able to mature enough or qualified to be elders or deacons, and then a long term, 5 to 10 years. And we would categorize these men within the eldership, and we talked about them. And we would do it on a chart there, and there's a sample in the book of how we did that. For the sake of developing a plan for each of these men based on where they are in this pipeline, if you will, in the development for a position of leadership, whether it be deacon or elder. I think it's exhibit number 1 in the book deals with that. And then we would assign an elder to mentor each prospect and collectively review that at least annually. We would sit down as the eldership and we would go over these men and their families, their wives, and talk about the progress they've made or the lack thereof in the last year, and then recategorize them based on how far we think they've advanced in this preparation to be leaders of the church. Because what category they fell in would determine what specifically we would recommend for their development. We'll talk about that in just a minute. So, and then we revise those at least once a year. We would be specific to each man based on his level of maturity, his strengths, and his weaknesses. We would review that prospect, and then we would develop a plan for each prospect, and we'll talk about that in just a minute about some specifics about that. On the short-term prospects, the people that were within a year or two of, we think, being qualified to be an elder or be a deacon, then we would meet with them and their wives, and this is outlined in Exhibit 14 there. We would jointly develop a personalized plan for this man and his spouse in her role. We would set up timetables and milestones, developmental assignments. We would discuss doctrinal positions with him and his wife, talk about his desire. We would have very frank discussions about his strengths and weaknesses,
as opposed to being developing the qualities needed for leadership. And we would come to a joint development of a leadership plan for the next year for those individuals. And I think this is a time to be very frank with everyone and let them know exactly where they were and if they had the desire. Then we developed some very specific plans about that. As far as their Bible knowledge, as far as developmental assignments, and I think this is something, and I'm not sure a lot of congregations do this, but you don't want to take a man and pigeonhole him into one particular ministry, never rotate him out of that ministry, and then 10 years later appoint him as an elder. If he's only been involved in the building and the grounds for 10 years as a deacon, and then you decide you make him as an elder, and what's his experience outside building and grounds? What we want to do is looking at some of the major categories of ministries, whether that's education or evangelism, youth, benevolence, these various categories or various ministries that the congregation has, and especially with men that are showing potential for leadership development, is make it a point to rotate their assignments around. And if you're one of those people, you can be proactive in asking to be rotated around to different assignments, different ministries within your congregation to get a broad base of experience. Because once you hit that eldership level, you're going to be responsible in part for all those ministries. If you don't have any exposure to them, then it's going to be difficult to oversee those in a proper way. So I see it a lot of times, and I've seen it with elders too, is they have a particular ministry that they really love. And if they're not careful, they gravitate to that ministry, and that's where they spend most of their time and effort. I know at Forest Park, we had one elder that just lived and breathed for foreign mission work. All about, he would go on trips every year, and we oversaw several families that lived in outside the United States, and that was his child there. But he wasn't too concerned about the youth. He wasn't too concerned about other things, but that was his thing. So I think we have to be careful, especially as elders or even as we're preparing to be leaders, that we force ourselves into ministries that we may not have the same comfort level with or the same desire, but to get the experience in various ministries. So I think that's important to do that. The term, and I'm not sure I've used it before, but the rifle versus shotgun approach. So often I see elders and preachers and others stand in front of the congregation and say, we need more deacons, or we need this, or we need people to teach, or we need this. And everybody in the congregation looks around and said, he must be talking to that person next to me, or my person on the other side of me. He's not talking to me, because that's a shotgun approach. But what I found worked extremely well is when we identified people that for particular ministries, we would call them in, one or two elders, close the door, sit them down, if their wife, if necessary, have their wife in there, and talk to them face to face about a particular need we had and how we thought that person would benefit the congregation and benefit themselves by being involved in that particular ministry. And that's what I call the rifle approach, is there's no misunderstanding about who's being talked to. It's only you and them in the room, okay? And you tell them that, we see potential in you. You have the qualities to help us with this ministry. We'll support you with funding and oversight. But we think you're the person for the job. And I found that probably 9 out of 10 people accepted that responsibility when you did it like that. When you shoot it out to the congregation, there aren't going to be many people that step up, and they may not be the ones you want to step up for a particular ministry. So I found that to be very effective once we identify somebody. As I mentioned, we meet with the prospects to review their progress, and you have to be quite honest with people. If we're going to have effective leaders, we've got to be honest in their preparation and where they are, and make necessary adjustments and make sure they get the proper training and proper exposure
to be prepared to lead the congregation. So I think those are very important to stay on top of that. And this chart, or this setup we have to do this, I think helps give, it helped us to stay on top of that and make sure that men in the pipeline were moving along and getting closer and closer to be qualified to be leaders in their congregations. Those that fell into the medium and long-term categories, we were more general or broad with and flexible in the scope of what we were suggesting that they be involved in. They were younger. They had, say, 3 to 5 to 10 years out before we thought the potential for leadership. But again, we would look at their study habits, at rotation assignments. We'd recommend books for them to read, attend lectureships. There's numerous lectureships, local and certainly at the colleges, and Polishing the Pulpit in Sevierville, Tennessee. If you haven't been there, that's a fantastic experience. Some of the greatest minds in the brotherhood at these lectureships. And Polishing the Pulpit is kind of getting to be the place to go. But I've been to Freed Hardeman and other lectureships, and have always benefited from those. I also want to encourage short-term mission trips. I don't know if your congregations are active in foreign missions or even in domestic missions, but I know the first trip I was been a Christian about 10 years and was asked to be a deacon over some of the foreign work. He sent me on a short-term mission trip for 2 or 3 weeks out in the Pacific, and in many ways it affected me spiritually much or more than my baptism did. And I wasn't baptized till I was 32. But it had a tremendous effect on me spiritually, is going on that mission trip, that short-term mission trip. Remote islands in the Pacific, and I came back a different person, and still am in some ways. I've been on 13 or 14 short-term mission trips in Central America and over in the Pacific in many areas, but extremely beneficial, not just in evangelism, but just to be have that kind of experience, I think is well worth the effort and the preparation for that. So I would think about that too. I think we have to remember that just because you get appointed a deacon or an elder does not suddenly make you an effective leader. It takes more than that. It takes a true leader as a person that has prepared for that over time. We probably all know, most of our preacher schools are 2 years. And I know of some young men that they get out of high school at 18 and they go to preacher school, and 2 years later they get their certificate and they're 20 years old, and somebody hires them as a youth minister or associate minister or possibly even a pulpit minister. And you can qualify and have enough Bible knowledge to do that role. You cannot do that in the role of an elder, because it takes more than just book Bible knowledge to be an effective elder. And we'll talk about that. As you know, it takes life experiences to be an effective elder, qualified elder, whether that's marriage, raising children, having a career, and learning those kind of things. And we'll talk about that a little more. But that's not something that comes automatically to a young person. But there's nothing wrong with starting to develop at that age to be a leader in the congregation. So a couple of scriptures I want to read. John 10:27. Look at first. Christ wrote, "My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me." You see the dual relationship there. Shepherds could call on their sheep grazing with several other flocks in the field, and only their sheep would follow them. And I did some research on this a while back, and it was fascinating to me that there would be thousands of sheep on these hills, and it would be a mixture of several different herds or flocks, if you will, that all had separate shepherds. And if one shepherd wanted to move on, he could stand up in the middle of those all those thousands of sheep and call his sheep, and they would stop grazing and follow him over to another location. They just recognized his voice, and they stopped. I know what imagine what 1,000 sheep on a hill looks like. To me, they're all going to look the same. but they knew his voice. Well, we take that same application, that same metaphor, and apply it to shepherds in the church. Our flocks have to know us and trust us in order to follow us. And that's the example we get here, and how we develop that trust in their leadership. We know the primary responsibility for developing leadership skills is with us. It's the same way that in Philippians 2:12, Paul wrote to the Philippian Christians saying, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. Who's got the number one responsibility for our salvation? We do. Who's got the number one responsibility for developing our leadership potential? Individuals. But elderships certainly have a responsibility to mentor and nurture and help with that developmental process. You know what James says in James 1:22-25? He talks about you have to not only hear, but you have to do what? To receive those blessings. Hear and do. You got to hear and do. You got to be active. You got to be proactive. Not only hear the word, but we have to do what the word teaches us to do if we want those blessings from it. One of the scriptures that one of my nieces had done a calligraphy there, and I had it on my wall in my office for many years. And, had it up there before I really understood how important it was. It was Philippians 4:13. Whenever you doubt what you can do, what's Philippians 4:13 tell us? I can do all things through Him who strengthens me. It's a we thing. It's not an I thing. The example I think about is, and I know you're familiar with Nehemiah, when he led some of the Jews back to Jerusalem, and they started to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, and the enemies of the Jews were trying to stop him from those people rebuilding that wall. Nehemiah prayed to God for protection while they were rebuilding that wall. And then what did he do? As soon as he prayed for protection, you know what it says next he did? He put up guards. And the first time I read that, I thought, well, Nehemiah didn't trust God. He prayed to him for protection. They turned around and put up guards. If you really believed he was going to protect him, why not have all the people work on the wall? He didn't need the guards. What point was I missing there?
That was God's protection.
God says, if you do your part, what?
I'll do my part.
I'll do my part. You know, it's a team thing. God expects us to do our part. And it's the same way with leadership development or overseeing a flock. We have that responsibility to make sure that we do our part with that. And I want to talk about sustaining effective leaders for a little while here. And again, I don't think that's as complicated as some would make it, and we'll talk about that. But as an introduction, I want to read 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17. 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17 says, let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. Here's the word double honor here, and there's some say slightly different meanings there. There are commentators that believe that this means that elders can be paid. There are situations where elders can receive monetary support for being an elder. And I did. We had one at our congregation before I became an elder. We had one of our elders that was paid a salary, and that was his full-time work. He taught classes, he preached, he did evangelism, he did local work, personal work, and was paid a salary for that. I don't see that often done, but there's nothing wrong with doing that if the situation supports that. But dedicated elders deserve not only the respect of the congregation, but also their support and involvement in the ministries. And we talked about, I think, in the past, the 80-20 rule and how oftentimes there aren't a lot of members of the congregation that are serving and supporting the elders as they should, and that can go both ways. I think obviously the members have responsibility, and the elders also have some responsibility to encourage and develop an atmosphere of serving there. So we do have to support them, and we support them Elders have to encourage the support physically, where people are involved in ministries and active. Obviously, spiritually, continually pray for our elders at Buford, and they ask for our prayers for obvious reasons. And there may be situations where monetary support might be justified for that. So, and I can tell you, I think I don't know. I haven't asked all of you, but I know Jeff's a nurse, and I'm not sure what you other two fellows do. But most elders they have a full-time job, support their families, and they're also an elder and have the responsibilities of being an elder. And I can tell you that requires some effort. I traveled a fair amount when I was serving as an elder, so that made it even a little more challenging that I was out of town a fair amount of the time. But I can tell you what my experience was. If you want to be effective as an elder that has a full-time job and has a family and still trying to serve without getting burnt out, you have to manage your time wisely, and you have to prioritize your time, compartmentalize your time. And you have responsibilities to support your family. You have responsibilities as a spiritual head of your family, and you have responsibilities as an overseer of the congregation. So you have to develop those priorities and manage your time wisely, I believe, if you want to be effective in that situation. We recently had an elder resign. He'd only been an elder just a couple of years, but he resigned at Buford, basically because his job had changed and they had cut back and given him additional responsibilities for his job, and he just wasn't able to. He basically said, "I'm not able to fulfill the responsibilities I believe I have as an elder because of my current employment situation." So he stepped down because he just did not feel he could do an adequate job. And he has come back as a deacon now, and hopefully working back into a leadership position. But that's something we have to be honest about. The congregation doesn't sacrifice in those situations. Your family doesn't sacrifice. So you have to make honest decisions, thoughtful decisions about that. What I think is the key to sustaining effective leaders is balance. And that sounds like a simple word, but I think that's the key to sustaining effective leadership. I don't believe it's all that complicated. A couple verses I want to look at. And one of the articles I wrote based on this is what we're going to talk about in the next few minutes. First of all, Acts 17:11, which is one of my favorite verses, because I can picture these Christians in Thessalonica doing just what this verse says. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Now I picture this is the Apostle Paul, and he has miraculous powers. He's teaching them, obviously from the Old Testament here. And what are these Jewish Christians doing? They're listening. Here's the Apostle Paul. He does miracles, and they're still doing what? He's got miraculous powers, but they're listening to him. But what are they doing?
They're still searching the scriptures daily.
They've got those scriptures. They've got those Old Testament scriptures in their hand, and they're saying, "Now, what'd you say again, Paul? What'd you quote there? I want to make sure that you're talking God. You and God's your word and God's word are coming up the same." Okay, and I think about that and how important it is for any member of the church, whether you're in a Bible class, whether you're in listening to a sermon, whether you're talking about Scripture, is that you have the Word there, you know the Word, you're a student of the Word, and that you can challenge folks. And 1 Peter 3:15 is another one of my favorite verses. Remember what that said? You've always been ready to do what?
Give a defense.
Yes, always be ready to give a defense, or other translations say always be ready to give an answer. But you give it with what? With what attitude does it say you give it with? Meekness and fear.
Yeah.
Okay. But be ready to give an answer.
What verse was that again? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
What verse was that?
1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 15. Always be ready to give an answer or give a defense with meekness and fear for the reason, for the hope that is in you. I'm going to tell you what, I give you a perfect example. On my first mission trip, we went to a little island called Tarawa. You may have heard about it. It was a big battle in World War II with the Japanese back then. Well, we went there, and there's 2 congregations there, and it took 2 days of flying to get to this little island. Plane only comes once a week. We were sitting there in the middle of the jungle, watching to one of the missionaries give a lesson to these 40 or 50 islanders there. And I was just sitting over on the side, and I was still in a daze that I was halfway around the world, sitting in this little jungle on this little island, and going, what am I doing here? What is going on? And I was only halfway listening to his lesson, and he finished it, and they had a question and answer. And the first question they asked, that missionary turned and pointed straight at me, and he said, Brother Whitmire will answer that question. And I had 40 strangers turn and look at me, and I didn't even hear the question the guy asked. And it just froze me for a second. But he repeated the question, and I knew the answer. It wasn't a complicated question, but I knew the answer. And one thing that missionary trips do is you will find out how much Bible knowledge you have. Because we don't get challenged very often here in the United States. We don't get asked those kind of questions. So it was a great example. So I think that's so important. Also, 2 Peter 1:3. We think about what we have in front of us as far as the scriptures. You know what the Thessalonians did here. They examined the scriptures. And in 2 Peter 1:3, Peter tells us this. His divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness through the knowledge of him, Christ, who has called us to his own glory and excellence. So what do we have in the scriptures? We have all things that pertain to life and godliness. What else is there between life and godliness? Does that not cover our entire existence?
Yeah.
Where are the answers? Right there. I had 2 young Mormon missionaries knock on my door. You probably had that happen in the past, just a few months ago. And they were fine, polite young men. And I talked to them about 45 minutes. And this is one of the verses that I asked them about. They had that Book of Mormon. They were holding it right here. Mm-hmm. And I said, well, I had several questions I asked them. But one was, I said, if the Bible tells us in 2 Peter 1:3 that it contains all things that pertain to life and godliness, why do we need the Book of Mormon? They just looked at me. They didn't know that verse existed. I'm sure most of their study is in the Book of Mormon. They weren't ready to give an answer. 1 Peter 3:15. Okay? We know what this book contains. So I think in the first part of this is this sustaining effective leaders, and I call it coloring between the lines. And that's about as simple as it gets, because you probably remember when you were young and your children, and now I'm telling my grandchildren the same thing. 3, 4, and 5-year-old kids I got running around. When you give them a coloring book and a crayon, what's the first thing you tell them? Stay between the lines. Okay, how does that simple little command apply to Scripture? And I have some verses here we're going to look at in Deuteronomy 4, verses 2 and 10. Here Moses is talking to the people. It's Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 2, and then verse 10. You shall not add to the word which I command you, nor take from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you. How on the day that you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, the Lord said to me, gather the people to me, that I may let them hear my word, so that they may learn to fear me all the days that they live on the earth, and that they may teach their children also. Keep my commandments. How do we sustain respect? Because that they may teach their children also. What are they trying to do? They're trying to Moses is telling the people to sustain that respect for God's word into the next generation. You look at Judges 2:10, and I've always wondered about this. In Judges 2:10 it says, "And all that generation also were gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them." This is Joshua and his generation. "And arose a generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work that he had done in Israel." What happened to the generation after Joshua? How did they come to not know the Lord or the work that he had done in Israel? Because they were not taught.
Mm-hmm.
They were not. They did not teach it to the children. Is that possible today, or that just happened back then? That's not possible today.
Well, when we were kids, our parents sent us to church, but they didn't go.
Moms were like that. My
Yeah.
parents were like that. I wasn't raised in the church, but even in the denominations,
Yeah.
My dad didn't go. My mother took me. But so what's the old saying? If you don't learn from history, you're going to repeat it, aren't we?
Mm-hmm.
What's the lesson from history here? We better be teaching our children. Because we're losing, according to Flavel Yeakley and his studies in the church, we're losing 50% of our children today. Other congregations to atheism, agnosticism. We've got to teach our children. Acts 20, verse 28 to 31. And here's when Paul called the elders from Ephesus down to the island of Miletus. And he told them, "Pay attention to yourselves and to all the flock in which the Holy Spirit," and he's talking to the elders, "to which the Holy Spirit made you overseers, to care for the church of God, which he obtained with his own blood. And I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come among you, not sparing the flock. And from your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things to draw the disciples after them. Therefore, be alert, remembering that for 3 years I did not cease day or night to admonish everyone with tears." See how important it is to know the Word and to stay with the Word. How important that is to sustain our leaders. Satan knows when congregations or its leaders are not knowledgeable in the Word, they're not teaching their children. If we're going to sustain effective leaders, we have got to stay in the Word. We don't stop studying the Bible because we become a deacon or an elder. That ought to be even more incentive to continue to study because of the increased responsibility we have to care and feed and protect the flock. And in Galatians 1, 6 to 10, Paul writing to the Galatians, and we know what happened there in the church of Galatia. The Jewish Christians were trying to pull the Christians back into the Jewish and following the Mosaic law. Paul wrote about that. He said, "I'm astonished that you are so quickly deserting him who called you in the grace of Christ and are turning to a different gospel. Not that there is another one, but there is some who trouble you and want to distort the gospel of Christ. But even if we or an angel from heaven should preach to you a gospel contrary to the one we preached to you, let him be accursed." So Paul's saying, even if I told you something, which is if we go back to Acts 17:11, even if I told you something that wasn't in accordance with the scriptures, you should curse me. It said, if anyone preaches you a gospel contrary to one you received, let him be accursed, for I am now seeking the approval of man, for am I now seeking the approval of man or of God? Or am I trying to please man? If I was still trying to please man, I would not be a servant of Christ. You see what he's saying here? We have to be ready for that, that we don't allow to be influenced. Satan's strongest tool, strongest weapon is deception. We deceive ourselves into thinking that we're pleasing God when we're not at times. Then Revelations 22, verses 18 to 19, and we're still talking about coloring between the lines here.
I warn everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book, if anyone adds to them, God will add to him the plagues that are described in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of the prophecy, God will take away his share in the tree of life and in the holy city, which are described in this book. Now, I think about, we read in Deuteronomy, Moses was telling his people in Deuteronomy is the same thing John was saying in Revelations 22. Know the word and stay with the word. Don't add to it. Don't take away from it. Don't change it. Don't alter it. Stay with it. In other words, color between the lines. Okay? That's a very simple lesson, but it's not always adhered to. Now, this is in areas of doctrine, and this is the part that I think sometimes we have problems with in the church. What they're talking about here is in areas of doctrine. Eldership what is the eldership's authority when it comes to areas of doctrine?
They have to be telling truth. And if one teaches error, they're responsible for correcting it.
Okay? They're responsible for adhering to God's word. The leadership of the congregation as a whole corporately is adhering to God's word. That's their responsible in areas of doctrine. Now, there are also areas of discretion in the church. Sometimes when you hear that word, the hair goes back up, a little bit on people's neck when you start talking about areas of discretion. Just a very simple example. What do we meet on Sundays? Doctrine or discretion?
Doctrine.
Doctrine, okay? Do we meet at 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock? Doctrine or discretion?
Discretion.
Discretion.
Okay? And there's a lot of that in there. Now, in areas of discretion, and some of the older elders I started with the first time, and I brought up some of these words in areas of discretion on some things I thought we ought to try, and I got some pushback at first. Said, wait a minute, we've been doing things, this way for 30 years. I said, that's fine, but I'm not sure that's the most effective way to do this at this time. Listen to, in Colossians, Paul writes in Colossians chapter 1, verse 23. If indeed you continue in the faith, stable and steadfast, not shifting from the hope of the gospel that you heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven, of which I, Paul, became a minister. He's telling us here that gospel was taken to every person on earth at that time. Now, when we read Matthew was written to who? To what group of people?
The Jews.
To the Jews. Now, how do we know that? We know, and why, what style or how did he write to be most effective to the Jews at getting the message of Christ to the Jews? Because he knew his audience. He kept quoting Old Testament prophecy. Now, why would he continue to quote Old Testament prophecy about Christ to his audience, the Jews? Because they believed in the Old Testament. They followed the Old Testament. So what he was saying was, this prophecy that you believe in, Christ fulfilled that prophecy. He, the Messiah that you predicted, that is predicted in your Old Testament, he is him. Matthew did that continually. But we read Mark and Luke, and you hardly see any Old Testament prophecies used. Now, why?
Gentiles.
He was speaking to the Jews. He was speaking to Gentiles. They didn't know anything about the Old Testament prophecy in Mosaic law, and they didn't care. But what did these people do when they were writing or speaking to various audiences that had different backgrounds? They used their discretion to be most effective at getting the message across. Same message, different methods. And the point I'm making here is that in the various ministries we have, and we think about, they had what back then? They had word of mouth and get on the horse and, down the road 10 miles. What do we have today to get the gospel out? It's just mind-boggling what we can do today and what
what methods we have today that were not available. We can be creative, think outside the box. That's sometimes that's an overused term by now, but we can be creative and experiment with ways to be more effective in carrying out the work of the church. All in areas of discretion, not in areas of doctrine. So I think there's a combination there. We obviously have to understand the difference between the two and when we use one and the other, but we can certainly be creative. And one thing I said to our elders, I said, they said, well, what if we try this new way and it doesn't work? Okay, then we'll stop doing it. We'll try some other way. Okay, there's nothing wrong with saying, we tried this, it didn't work. Now we're going to try this. That's okay in areas of discretion. And I think we have to make sure we don't we don't strap ourselves in where we're not thinking freely about different ways to be effective in getting the word out. So I think those two things are very important. I mentioned here in Luke 19:10 is basically it's what the church is all about, isn't it? Christ told us what? He was here to do what? Seek and save the lost. That's it. And that's what my church should be doing. Seek and save the lost. Now the question is,
come to make me rich?
Now the question is, how do we go about doing that? Well, you preach the word, you teach the word. Well, how do we go about accomplishing that? The methods. We can certainly experiment with different methods and the tools we have to do that. So I think that's an important point there. I want to talk about, for the next few minutes, secular versus spiritual leadership. How these, if you know what I mean, we can't see the board, I want to put up the board. Overlapping circles, where there are some things that are done in secular leadership that would be effective in the leadership of the church. And there are some things we'll talk about in just a minute where I don't think they're separate. There are things that may work with secular leadership in organizations that are not appropriate for the church. But I think we can learn from some things that are done in secular organizations that would be effective in leadership in the church. Now, I have some background in that in my position, and I saw overlap there, and then there were areas where I didn't think there were overlap. We'll talk about some of those. You hear a lot in the business world about having a vision. I think sometimes we get, in the church, we get maybe too down in the weeds. The leadership gets too down in the weeds, overseeing the day-to-day operation or function of a congregation without taking time periodically to step back from that and to dream and to visualize about that congregation and where you want it to be 5 or 10 years from now, what you want to be involved in, what ministries you want to try to strengthen. And take the time as a group, individually, but as a group also. Our eldership, we used to go up into the North Georgia mountains for a weekend. Just the elders. We do Friday night and all day Saturday and come back Saturday night. And we would talk about big picture stuff. We didn't talk about who's going to serve on the Lord's Supper tomorrow or, who's going to be answering the phone. We talked about things out there. What we would like to see our congregation, where we would like to see our congregation 3 or 5 or 10 years from now. And we visualize those things. So I think we have to be careful that leaders take time to do that, just like leaders in the business world or in secular organizations do. They take time to dream, to visualize things. And then they can come back and start putting up and start establishing milestones for how we're going to accomplish those dreams and put those into reality. And I think that's very important that leaders take the time in the church to do that. Also about organization. We know the Lord expects us to be good stewards of our time and energy, as well as our finances. And I think if we have a good organization in the church, and I'm not necessarily talking about scriptural organization with deacons and elders and preachers, of course we have to have that, but also to be organized in our ministries, so that we can be good stewards of our time and energy and the time and energy of the members of the congregation that are involved in these ministries. They can be effective and produce results. We mentioned Titus 1:5 before, but and I think about this, that Paul was an inspired apostle. He established these congregations on the island of Crete. He gave some miraculous powers, but yet just a few years later, he told Titus to go back to Crete to appoint elders. And it says the reason he did that is what? So that you might put what remained there into order. Establish order by appointing elders in every town as I directed you. 1 Corinthians 14:40 says we should do all things how? Decently and in order. Okay? And that application can be in more than one aspect of the church's work. But it's not just the organizational structure of deacons and elders and preachers, members and ministries, but how we go about doing things so that we can be effective. Are we being as effective as we can in the work of the church, and how we go about doing that? We have to have some honest examination of how we're doing that. I think sometimes we think that being efficient is the same as being effective. Those are not the same things. Effective, as a definition of effective, is adequate to accomplish a purpose, producing the intended or expected result. Being effective is about producing the right result. Now, efficient is performing or functioning in the best possible manner with the least waste or time and energy. Being effective is about results. Being efficient is about the process. The problem with being efficient is we can be efficient at doing the wrong thing and not getting the right results. We have to be careful. Like I was listening, we had a speaker, David Shannon from the Mount Juliet Church of Christ near Nashville a couple of weeks ago on the family, did a meeting for us. And he talked about starting something with the end in mind. Starting a ministry or a project, we start with the end in mind, which means, what do we want to accomplish out of this? What's the end game for this? Before we start it, we need to know what the end game is. What do we want to accomplish? And then we start developing a plan to bring us to that end game at a certain time. So it's important that we understand what we want to accomplish. What results do we want? If we decide to go on a mission trip somewhere, a congregation said, we're going to support this missionary. What do we want to accomplish with that group mission trip? Not only for the people that are there, but the people that go on that. What do we want to accomplish? What do we want those people to learn from that? The people that go and the people that we're going to see. So I think it's important with whatever work or whatever ministry a congregation is doing, that the leadership always thinks about, what are we going to accomplish with this? How are we going to see that we're accomplishing what we meant to accomplish as we develop this? I know up around where I live, they're doing a lot of road work. They're adding lanes to highways, and they're continually over budget and past the deadline. That never fails to me. And I thought, did anybody think when you said we're going to add this lane to this highway that we're going to have it done for this amount of money and we're going to have it done by this date? Everything that happens from the time you take that first shovel full of dirt is bringing us toward that date for that amount of money. When does that ever happen? Especially in governments. It costs twice as much and it takes twice as long. It seems like nobody had the end game in mind when they started that. So they're not effective at accomplishing what they meant to accomplish. I think the same thing can certainly apply to the church. An easy way, I think, to remember that is that being effective is about doing the right things, while being efficient is doing things in the right manner. You may not be doing the right thing, but you're doing it in an efficient manner. We have to always be careful that we're effective at what we do. And that's certainly what we're talking about here in sustaining and developing effective leaders. We are effective at developing men and sustaining those men in leadership positions, and bringing in other men up and training them for that position. My experience. I mentioned how important I think that is, especially for elders and deacons. It's not something that a 20 or 25-year-old does. I don't know about you. What's the youngest age you've ever seen for an elder that you know of?
My father was 43.
43?
In the 40s.
About in the 40s. How about you, Lawrence?
I haven't really seen any young elders.
Well, that's good. I think that's good. The youngest I've seen is 34. And believe it or not, that's the man that baptized me, but he wasn't 34 when he baptized me. He was about 60 or so. But his was a very unusual situation. He did not want to be an elder at 34, but he was pressured because of a situation at that particular congregation, and that his maturity. His father was an elder and a preacher. He was an elder for over 50 years. His father was. I knew him for a few years before he died, and he was brought up as a rare exception to the rule as far as his maturity at such a young age. So very unusual. I was 52, and I think, like you, most elders, early mid-40s, about as young as I see them. Generally, they're probably in their 50s and sometimes older than that. And not that there's an age requirement, but it says that elders are not to, they're not to be what?
Novice.
They're not to be novices, okay? And that novice does not just pertain to Bible knowledge. It pertains to life experiences, to the application of knowledge, wisdom, the application of knowledge, used in dealing with people, families, children, careers, those type of things that all blend into developing. Sometimes we have, we call them child prodigies in business, especially it seems in this information technology world. You see, guys coming out 20, 25 years old that are suddenly multimillionaires, like Zuckerberg and some of these others.
Speaking of being a novice, I know a congregation, there was a young minister who was in selection for becoming a minister of a congregation. He was good. He had book knowledge, real charismatic, intellectual and everything. However, he got exposed to experience. He was dating a young lady, and there was some question whether there was, some hanky-panky going on behind closed doors. So, the older people see the young couple, they're going to talk. So somebody said something about his girlfriend. He heard it. She told him, and he brought it in front of the congregation. And that was not good, because that's not his wife. So he said novice. It made me think about life experiences.
That's right. I think we're all probably to the age where we've learned a few things by making mistakes in our various capacities as we mature through life, and that's certainly an important part of that. These life experiences. And we'll talk about the individual qualifications in a few weeks. We'll look at some of those and how those apply. Wisdom is simply the application of knowledge, and the acquisition of wisdom, or the application of knowledge. The acquisition of knowledge takes time, doesn't it? It takes time to do that. An example I thought of, and this was, I guess, probably a year ago, you may or may not have heard about it. There was a young man named Martin, last name was S-H-K-E-L-I, Shkelly. He was in the hedge fund business, trading stocks. He made hundreds of millions of dollars before he was 30 years old. Hundreds of millions of dollars in a very short time, in very risky hedge funds. And that's a complicated system there. But and what he did with some of that is he purchased controlling stock in a pharmaceutical company named Turing, T-U-R-I-N-G, Turing Pharmaceuticals. And he made himself CEO because he had enough stock that he was appointed CEO at 30 years old of this major pharmaceutical, because this hundreds of millions of dollars he made in hedge funds, he decided to buy controlling interest in this pharmaceutical company. And he was CEO at 30 years old. Well, they had a particular product, a particular drug that was a life-saving drug for a particular illness that only they had the patent on it, and only they produced it. And it sold for $13.50 per dose. He decided unilaterally, for the stockholders' benefit, of which he was the major stockholder, to raise the price to $750 per dose. People had to take several doses a day. It was a cancer-fighting drug. He did it out of pure greed. We could talk about another lesson about what I think about greed and how that leads to a lot of other sins. But he gained an awful lot of negative press and notoriety because of his heartless decision to basically put this drug out of the reach of so many people that needed it to stay alive. He caught a lot of flack, and it didn't seem to bother him at all. But about a year later, he was indicted for securities fraud by the federal government. So apparently some of the way he made that hundreds of millions of dollars was not in accordance with the securities law. But an example, I think, of someone who was a leader in that organization because of his money and the power to control the stock in that organization. But he certainly was not qualified to be a leader in the sense of having the life experiences or the knowledge or wisdom to deal with it properly. And we certainly don't want leaders in the church that are not that don't have that maturity, that spiritual maturity and life experiences that are necessary. I did hear one. We had a congregation on the south side of Atlanta. Years ago, I was talking to one of the elders down there, and he made the statement that they would never appoint an elder unless he had been raised at that congregation. Because the person that was not raised there would not have the knowledge of the people at that congregation in order to shepherd them. What do you think about that?
I think that's very short-sighted.
Okay.
You're never going to have new ideas. You need, it's great to have some guys like that. That's great. But you really need some elders that have moved around, have been to other congregations to see how other congregations operate.
I think you're absolutely right. I didn't want to get in an argument with the man. I wasn't a member of that congregation, but I thought the same thing, Jeff, that one, you're going to limit yourself in the men you have available for elderships because of that, obviously. And two, it limits, as you said, it takes away the experience of being under other elderships and other life experiences and other experiences in congregations. So there's certainly no scriptural basis for that. I think that's taking this know the flock to the extreme in that case. So I think there has to be a balance again, and certainly you mentioned if you have several elders, that to have some of the elders that have been there for 20 or 30 years brings a certain amount of institutional knowledge there, but certainly elders from other congregations or members that have moved in bring a wealth of experiences with them. And there's more than one way to do things in many of the things that elderships do. So that's important too. Analytical skills is another one that we see obviously in secular organizations that would be valuable in the church organization. We almost deal with interpersonal issues and financial issues, operational issues, and having analytical skills I think is just important in the church as it is in secular organizations because of the various activities and works that they're involved in. So it's important, I think, and we'll talk more about that later, to have have a mix of elders. I don't think you want 10 businessmen. You don't necessarily want 10 retired preachers. You know, it's good to have a mix of various talents that can bring those in. So now I want to talk about some differing, where circles, different circles that do not overlap, that I think you cannot necessarily apply from a secular organization to the church organization. One is the concept of a board of directors versus an eldership. I've heard that term used, that the elders are like a board of directors. Maybe in some ways, but I don't think that that's a good comparison for a couple reasons. I'm on several boards that they're church-related organizations, but they're not congregational boards. They're boards of parachurch organizations. Georgia Agape here, you may have Agape in a similar organization in Kansas or Alabama, but we have a Georgia Agape, and basically it's a foster care and adoption agency, Christian based. It is supported by congregations of the Lord's Church, but I know when I was on that board a few years, we had very little dealings with the employees of that organization on a day-to-day basis. That wasn't the purpose of that board. It was to set policy, it was to raise funds, but it was not to be involved in the day-to-day operation of Georgia Agape. I didn't know all the employees. There was 8 or 10 of them. I didn't have any reason to know them. That wasn't my responsibility. Elderships are not the same way.
Yes, and in that board of directors also, you're going to have a hierarchy.
You are going to have a hierarchy. That's right. Well, you don't have in an eldership.
Right.
Or you should not have in an eldership. Let's put it that way.
Shouldn't have.
Yeah, we shouldn't have. I don't find the term chief elder anywhere in the scriptures, but apparently in a lot of our congregations we have some de facto chief elders, and that's unfortunate. But what we do have is we know that elderships are not to be disassociated with the members. And I've heard of elderships that spend most of their time in the back meeting room. They don't go to social functions. They don't visit people's homes. They meet and they make these decisions, and that's it. And they have very little interaction with the congregation. And they're almost operating more as a board of directors than they are shepherds or an eldership. And that's not what God intended for that. There's a preacher in the church. His name is Lynn Anderson. He wrote a book called "They Smell Like Sheep," and I do not agree with his take on the authority of elders. But I think what I got out of the book that I thought was helpful was the title and how he applied that. Shepherds are to smell like sheep. Why do shepherds smell like sheep?
They're around them all the time.
They're in them. They're in amongst them all the time, aren't they? They don't shepherd from up at the farmhouse or up at the barn or up on a hill. They're among their flock. And he was making the same application, which I think was valid, is that shepherds in the Lord's church need to smell like their sheep. They need to be among them. Not holed up in a back room, not constantly making private decisions, and not interacting with the flock. And that doesn't mean on just Sundays and Wednesdays. They have to be in their homes and at activities of the church. I know we talked about time restraints for elders, and my thought on that is that not every elder has to be at every function or every meeting of the Lord's church. That's too much to ask of elders. What I do believe is that there ought to be at least one elder at every function, and preferably the elder, and we'll talk more about this later, the elder that has primary responsibility for that ministry. I don't think all elderships do that, but I would certainly recommend it. That the way we worked was that we broke the various ministries up, and each elder had responsibility for a certain number of ministries. Primary responsibility, not sole responsibility. He still reported to the eldership, but that the deacons that were over those ministries, he was their primary contact point. I was over the Bible school, and I was over youth at one time, and over foreign missions. And those deacons and other ministry leaders came to me first, and then I would go to the eldership and brief them on it as a hierarchy, and that was a very effective way to do that. That if there's a function that was under my responsibility primarily, I tried to be at that function. If not, I would ask one of the other elders to serve and to be at that. So not only to know what's going on, but also to show the congregation that we were interested in that particular ministry or that function or what was going on, that activity, and that we cared about those people and what they were doing. So a lot of that is, and that helped build the trust and respect of the congregation for the eldership. So I think that's important to do that.
It also shows the congregation that you're working. They don't want to see you just sitting around.
Okay, that's right. It shows the congregation that you're involved, you're active, and that you're not taking an honorary position and not working for it. And that's the next point I make here is in 1 Timothy 3:1, it talks about if you desire the office of an elder, it says you desire a good what?
Work.
A good work. Not a good chair, not a good position, not a good office, but a good work. Okay? And we know what work is an active word. That's a verb. And we should be active in that. And we have to remember that you come into that position knowing that you're going to be expected to be active in the oversight of the congregation. Active and involved, especially in those ministries where which you may have a primary responsibility. The source of power. Where do the elderships get their source of power versus secular organizations? Let's look at 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 3. It says, not domineering, Peter referring to elders here, not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. We talked about CEOs and some boards that have very little interaction with the people, the operational people in an organization. They set policy, they worry about finances, but they have very little to do with the day-to-day operation of the organization. And sometimes they exhibit their authority in a domineering way because they control the paychecks and the careers and futures of people. So they can use those in selfish ways to do that. And that certainly is not appropriate for the eldership. So there's a big difference there when the elders and people in positions of authority in secular organizations. In fact, my wife retired from Delta Airlines a few years ago, and they had a change in CEOs. It's probably going back 10 or 15 years ago, and they chose a man named Allen, who was the chief financial officer of a public utility in Chicago, Illinois. He was the CEO of Delta Airlines. Now, he was a very intelligent man, and he knew money. He knew finances. He did not know a first thing about an airplane or an operation of an airline. Mm-hmm. But they didn't bring him in for that. They brought him in because of his intelligence and his contacts and his knowledge of finances. He was only there a few years and he moved on, or they moved him on. And now they have someone in there that came up in the organization that knows the airline business, in addition to the other responsibilities of the CEO. So, and certainly that's not an effective way to oversee a congregation. Personal relationships, distant versus familiar. I want to look at John chapter 10 here, verses 4 and 5, and then chapter 13, 34 and 35. First, we'll look at John chapter 10, verses 4 and 5. It said, when he has brought out all his own, referring to Christ, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, for they know his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but they will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of the stranger. Chapter 13, verses 34 and 35, a new commandment I give you, that you love one another, just as I have loved you. You also love one another. By this, all people will know you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. congregation has to be able to see and experience the love of the eldership for the souls of that congregation, the shepherds of that flock. I think they have to see it, they have to hear it, in ways they have to feel it, they have to sense it. The elderships or the elders are not doing this for personal gain. They're not doing it to stroke their egos. They're doing it because they love the souls of the people that they oversee and that they shepherd. So I think that's extremely important. Leadership methods. Drive versus lead. Force order versus motivate, encourage. We think about different styles of leadership. And I thought about, well, most of us love a good cowboy movie every now and then, don't we? It's kind of a man thing. How do the cowboys get the cattle to move from one place to another?
They drive them.
They drive them, don't they? They drive them from the front to the back. They drive them from the back, don't they?
Yeah.
They yell at them, they fire the guns, they whip their whatever, and they're driving them from the back. They're forcing them forward. They don't lead. They're back there driving. Okay? So that's a method of leadership. So what do we see done with shepherds and their flock? Do we see a shepherd drive their flock from the back?
They lead.
They lead from the front, don't they? They lead from the front. We talked about, I think, a little bit about why sheep follow their leader. They trust them to go first, don't they? They trust them to go first. I thought about it, and it's not a passage that's in the Bible, but it's based on a Bible passage about don't be anxious about tomorrow. Here's what I came up with. Don't worry. This is God speaking to us, to a Christian. Don't worry about tomorrow. I'm already there. No matter what's going to happen tomorrow, God's already there. He's timeless. He's already there. He's waiting for us that next day. We don't have to worry about that. That we can find peace and comfort in the trust we have that God is there. What I thought about, something happened, I say I'm at the Beaufort, Georgia congregation. We had a preacher there for about 10 years. And oddly enough, his father was the preacher at the church where I was baptized 35, 40 years ago. And I knew this man when he was a teenager. And then he had gone to different congregations, became a preacher, and he was mid-late 50s now, I guess. And the elders told him after 10, 11 years that it was time for a change. That's basically what they told him, that we think it's time for a change in the congregation. We're going in a different direction. We don't have anything, we don't have any issue with you as far as doctrine goes, as far as your personal life. But we just think it's time for a change. And, it caught him by surprise. He did not. I believe he thought he was going to retire. That was going to be his congregation. Well, he retired another 10, 15 years. The congregation, it was a shock to the congregation because there was no specific reason. I know that the elders were concerned about how the congregation was going to react to this change because they were not in any hurry to find a replacement. They didn't have one in mind, and it took about 6 months of interviewing and researching before they hired another man. In the congregation, we had plenty of men that could preach. That wasn't an issue, but a lot of people talked. We talked among ourselves in the congregation about why that was done and should it have been done, and was that the best thing for the congregation? And one of the elders asked me about a couple of weeks after they had announced it. And when they announced it, That was the last time that preacher, our current preacher, was in the congregation, was in the pulpit. That was it right there. They had a contract and had several months, pay due because of his contract, and he got a check, and that was it. He was done right there. And one of the elders asked me about, I think it relates to what we're talking about here. He asked me what I thought about that, or did I have a problem with how this was handled or making this change. And I had given that some thought and talked to my wife about it and some other people, and I said, no, it does not give me a problem, but I want you to know why it does not give me a problem. I knew this man. I've known him for 40 years. I know his father and his family, and they're good folks. But I'll tell you why it's not a problem for me. I said, one is, I believe that I know where the hearts of the elders of this congregation are. Your heart is with God, and you want the very best for this congregation. I absolutely believe that 100%. And I also believe that I trust you as a group. I trust your judgment without knowing all the particulars, and it's not for me to know. I trust your judgment. I know your hearts, and I trust your judgment. That's why it's not a problem for me. I'm not going to badmouth it. I'm not going to second guess what you've done. I will pray for you in your selection process that you find the right person for this congregation, and this congregation is the right congregation for the person you bring in. And once the dust settled, if you will, after a few weeks, and there was a lot of rumblings, other people started filling in, and it settled down, and it was okay. And we like.
I have a question.
Go ahead. Let me just finish the point. Yeah. Let's go. And we hired a younger man, which I think was part of the issue, and it's working out good. But because of the relationship that eldership had with the congregation in general, about what we thought of those men, that we trusted them, we respected them, is that a situation that could have developed problems and splits in the congregation did not, because of that trust that we had and respect for that as shepherds. And you see what can be accomplished. And if that trust and respect had not been there, then a situation like that could easily cause a schism or cause problems in the congregation.
Mm-hmm. Now, in this process, what voice does the congregation have it? I mean, when you have, hiring and firing preachers, congregation is involved with the selection also.
Well, that's
when they come interview. I mean, how do all this?
That's a good question. That's a good question, and I'm going to tell you, we're getting a little off track here, but I'm about finished with what I wanted to cover. What I wanted to cover tonight, and how close are we? Well, we're 8:03, so we'll wrap it up with this. A lot of people talk to the elders individually after this was announced. So the elders spent a lot of time, and they said, anybody that wants to talk to us collectively or individually as elders, we will sit down and talk as long as you want. Explain as far as we can explain, what's proper to explain about this, which they did. I know a lot of people talked to the elders over the next several weeks. Here's how they interviewed them. They did not bring anyone in to preach to the congregation, any prospective preacher, not one, which is unusual in my past experience. And they did that for a reason. One is that almost all these preachers that they interviewed were currently preachers at another congregation that had a website that archived all the sermons. And all the elders would go, when they got an application in that they wanted to look at further, all the elders would go to that website and listen to various sermons. One thought they had was that if you bring somebody in, you're going to hear his very best sermon that he's got, that he saves for situations like this. You're not going to get his every Sunday sermon. You're going to get the best one he's got. You go online and start picking ones out over the last 6 months, and you're going to get what you're going to see week in and week out.
You're going to get a feel for
right. You're going to get a feel for it. That's right. That's right. And they did it that way, and they hired the individual without any public tryouts. They brought him up a couple times, him and his wife, interviewed them, spent a couple days with them, getting to know them getting to know the congregation, what would be expected of him, checked out his references, all those things. But he did not, none of the people that they considered spoke before the congregation. And that was a different way of doing things. And people had, people that kind of took some people back.
Well, like I said, what is the voice of the congregation? Was that right? Was that biblical? I mean, because the congregation didn't have a say so. If they're paying an offering, I could be like, you're getting my money. I'm paying money to this church. I'm giving an offering to this church. And here's a minister that I like. And without my voice, y'all decide, okay, he's no longer needed here. We're going to get somebody else. And you did that without consulting me as a member of this congregation, or we as the body of Christ, the congregation. Our voice wasn't heard. How does that play in, when...
Let me, Jeff, Lawrence, what do you think about that?
I have one thing about that. It's one, we got to understand that the church as a whole, the elders are there to oversee the flock, and their judgment should always, because the Bible tells us obey the authority that that's above us. So if we're supposed to obey that, their best interest is at hand, and they know that our best interest is at hand due to the fact we know they have studied that. We know they have did some carefully praying. We know they have did some understanding. And number two is that regardless if you pay monies, that money is God's money. It's not our money. We got to take our own feelings out of that and our emotions out of that. We have to rely on our elders as making a decision, because we will make an emotional decision. And God don't want us to make those mistakes. And so we got to rely on our elders and rely on our leadership. And that's the reason they're there, and that's the reason God appointed them.
Okay. Jeff?
Well, I'll just ditto pretty much what he said. I mean, the eldership is there to make the decisions. If it's all going to a committee by every member, then if I donate $100 a week, does that mean I get 100 votes compared to the other person sitting next to me that only donates $10 a week? You start to get really dicey when you start going down that path. But overall, it's up to the elders, and they have to. That's why they're supposed to be experienced and be biblical and all those things to make a decision. And that's right or wrong. That's what they're supposed to do.
Okay. Good points. Good points. And I would just tell you.
Therefore, the congregation don't have. They just have to trust the elders.
Well, I would say that that's probably the only time I've ever seen. I don't know if either anybody here has seen that done like that before. When there's a change in preachers, it was the first time I had seen it done. Mm-hmm. I can only tell you that it may be unique to the situation at Buford, but it has worked out well for the congregation. He's been there since September now. I say younger, he's mid-30s as opposed to late 50s. So, and a bulk of our congregation falls in that 30 to 50 age group. We have kind of a unique congregation there. We have a lot of folks in that 30 to 50 age group. So I think he probably relates better to them, him and his wife, and I think that's at least one of the reasons that that the elders were doing that. But that's where wisdom of the eldership comes in and how to handle that. And
well, I see, from what the gentleman was saying on the internet, it makes sense when you have the elders. But you just have to trust the process and trust God. Also, what that does is it alleviates a lot of problems when you're hiring and firing a minister when there are no elders.
Yeah,
So
that's,
now you get to another problem.
that's one of the reasons all congregations have elders, so you don't have to try to hire and fire a preacher
And the reason I
in a
asked
men's business meeting.
the reason I asked that question is because I'm not used to seeing that when the elders. I'm used to another way of doing it. I'm used to being in congregations without elders. So when I hear this,
Yes.
I have a certain mindset that when there's no elders there, and you hire and fire a minister, the congregation has a voice. Well, so what I'm hearing
Different
now,
situation.
you know, it's not rule of thumb. When you have elders in place, there's a different format, a different way of doing things than when you don't have them in.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So
And you can see, I think, and we have an outstanding, we have, I think, 8 elders now. We had 10, a couple moved away, but they're an outstanding, very different, but an outstanding group of men that have the trust and respect of the congregation. So you can see the importance of maintaining unity, congregational unity, that you have an eldership that is trust and respect. When you have those things, you can make dramatic changes for the betterment of the congregation and it be accepted by the congregation.
Like I shared with you before, I was in a situation where there were no elders and the so-called trustees fired the preacher without the voice of the congregation. I don't think in that situation that was right, because you don't have any elders and you don't have the oversight over the congregation. So collectively, we together as a congregation try to look out for the best interests of the congregation.
And I would agree with you on that point. If you don't have elders, then it's a different situation. But again, see importance. Well, man, I appreciate it. Anytime during the week, if there's anything you want to talk about or discuss or question or comment, feel free to call me or email me or text me or whatever you want to do. I'll be glad to take the time to talk to you about anything you'd like to talk about. So, any questions or comments before we close off?
I want to thank those gentlemen for that comment. They cleared some things up for me.
Did you both hear that?
Yes.
Good. Yeah, Lawrence, appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Jerome's comments. This is kind of a unique, some folks here and some folks online. It's a unique experience, at least for me it is, which I'm enjoying it more each week. So appreciate your attention, appreciate you all being involved with the class. And if you'll bow with me, we'll close out this class. Almighty God, it's such a blessing we have to study from your word. And Father, we hope that we gain even more appreciation for the organization of your church and how you would have it to be organized. And we pray that you'll be with us as we look at the subject of leadership in the local church, and then we all come away with this with a better understanding of what you would have us to do, and how we can help to train up men to be leaders, and that we sustain that leadership, and that we continue to function as you would have us to do in your church. We're so grateful for the talents that you've given us, and we pray that we'll use those talents to glorify you. We ask you to watch over us until we meet again. We ask this in your son's name. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, man. We'll see you next year.
All right. Thank you.
All right.
Oh, you got to click it, aren't you?